Hello and welcome back to the Artisfy Codecast. Today I'm going to be starting the code for the inputjs library. So let's get right to it, okay? So yesterday we wrote up the specification for the inputjs library, all of the steps that we want to take, and we wrote up a quick example of what it's going to be like to use the inputjs library. So there's a couple things I want to do first. One is just look at the output.js library and just quickly see, are there any functions in here that we want to adapt to be used in our input.js library, because these are kind of interrelated pieces of code, the output and the input. Okay, so this is the main function for output.js, and I'm going to reorganize this later, but I do really like how this is written in general. So we have the root data here. We see if the element can be parsed. So the idea behind, just so you know, the idea behind output.js, which is this code here, is that it's going to loop through all of the child elements from a root node. So the children of that, and then the children of those children, etc., all the way down to the very bottom of the DOM elements, right, where there's nothing left. There's only text nodes, right? And it's going to grab any data attributes that look like this. So data x type. And I'm going to change that syntax to be data O type, because O is going to stand for output, but that's a very small change. So it's going to look for those, and then it's going to grab the data from that element, either by creating a new data structure, like an object or an array, or by creating a new object and filling it with a key and a value. Okay, so first we see, okay, can we parse this? Does it have the right attribute? If it can be parsed, we're going to get, we're going to see if we have parent data already established. And that means, have we already gone through this loop before and gotten some data? If we have, we're going to add the data from this current element to the parent data and then return a new parent data. And if there's no parent data, we're going to create a new instance of the parent data and set the root data to the parent data, because the root data is up here, right? And we only set that once. We only set that on our first time through, our first loop through, because that's going to say it's like a list, right? At the very top, right? One of the top DOM nodes says, okay, I'm a container that's of type list. Then everything inside of that is going to be inside that original list. So we only need to keep track of the initial root data, because everything that we add to that we can reference from this root data, right? Because it'll be inside of it. Okay, and then the last thing we do is we turn the element's children into an array. We loop over that array, and then we call this same function, get data from DOM, using this child element and passing in the parent data. And that's it. That should, or that actually does work right now. It's able to turn, as far as I know, an infinitely nested, group of child elements into an object, or an array with objects in it, with arrays in it, with objects, all the way down, arrays and objects. So now that we have that, let's just look at, so when we create the data from the object, we use this function, Parse Node. So that's interesting. I wonder where we define that. Maybe, okay, yeah, okay, sorry. We defined it right here. in our parse dom slash dash dash parse node file. That makes sense. Okay, so we have parse node, and then for the adding the data from the element to the data object, are there any special functions we have here? Is parent data an object? If it is, we're going to get the key from it, and then we're going to set the key of the node data equal to the value of the node data. So that kind of makes sense, right? So if we're working with an object, we're going to be working with keys and values. Otherwise, we're going to oh, yeah, okay. And if there's a key, we're going to, if there's a key on this node, that's what we're going to attach it as. Otherwise, the value itself is going to be the object, and so we're going to extend the parent data with that. So yeah, okay. I mean, we don't need to understand this code right now. This is the output.js code. But yeah, I mean, otherwise it's going to be a list, and we're going to push in the value. But I just wanted to see, is there anything complicated going on here, that we use an external helper library or function to handle, and we don't. So this is all pretty simple. It might be something that comes in to play in the inputjs library, but I don't think it will. However, this I think will. So parse node, we get the type of the element, and then we return the element type. We return the key, which can be null, and then if the element type is list, we would just return an array. Otherwise, we get the data from the node. And so this is the complicated part. Okay, so get data from node. I know, so we're doing two things here. So it's a little confusing reading this code. This code should be simpler. But it's not right now. Maybe we'll rewrite it. But right now we're getting two different types of data. We're getting attributes that start with data-x-key, and we're getting attributes that start with data-x-location-key. And we're looping through all of the attributes on the element. So that's what this thing does. It's just going to take an element as the first argument, and then the callback function is going to have the attribute name and the attribute value as the first two arguments or parameters. And then we say, okay, so like, does the attribute name match the first key prefix, or does it match the location key prefix? And it can match both, right? Because we can have, or no, it can't match both. A single one can't match both. So we could just as easily have, an else if here. And we probably should, because that saves a little bit of processing, because we don't have to check this one. Like we'll never have to check this one if this one matches. Okay, so if it matches this one, we're going to cut out the everything after this or everything after this, right? So we're just going to be left with the remaining value, which is going to be something. It's going to be the key name that we want. Okay, so we get the key name, we'll camel case the key name, and then we'll add to the return object the key named camel cased and the attribute value. So if we have on a single element a bunch of data x key values, we're going to loop through all of them and add them as keys to this return object, with their values being the text value that is, this attribute is set to. Okay, so and then the get location key value, basically that's going to crawl the DOM using a selector, which can either be the current element or the a selector that's actually passed in, something that's more than just a dot, and then it's going to get the inner text from that element. And that's not always going to be the case with the new functionality. I'm thinking about making it so that it can get a value, or it can get an href, or it can get a source from like an image. Okay, so I'm thinking it might be necessary to rewrite output.js before we continue. But I think actually most of what we're going to be doing today with the output.js library, or sorry, with the input.js library, is just kind of planning it out and like writing code, but just writing our ideal kind of API for it. So like you can see this code, it's like, in my opinion, it's very well organized. It's better than a lot of code that I write. And it's because I thought through ahead of time, like, okay, what happens first, like in general steps, what happens first, what happens second, what happens third. And I wrote out these documentation strings. And then I wrote out my like ideal, I don't know how to say this, like my ideal API. It's not really that. It's like my ideal flow, like my ideal function followed by my next like, ideal function for like what we're doing in this main function. Um, and I think, if you just kind of read through these documentation strings, it kind of makes sense what's happening. You can kind of guess at what's happening. And I think there's probably an even simpler way of writing this code, and I would love to explore that in the future. But in general, I think this is a good practice, writing out the documentation strings, exactly what you want to happen, when you want it to happen, and then writing out your ideal kind of like function API, right? Where like, by API, I just mean like, so it's API is an application programming interface, and it's basically like, how is a developer interacting with your code or your functionality? And usually it's some kind of remote API. So you might like reach out to like a mapping software and be like, and say like, I have this address, what's its zip code, right? Something like that. Um, and but here, we're working with local code. But by API, I just mean like, what does this do? Well, it adds the data from the element to the data object, and that's it says exactly what it does. I pass in the element and the parent data. It makes sense to me. So that's what I want from an API, is something that it does what it says it does, and it does it how I would expect it to do it. Okay, so let's go into input. Um, okay, so this is actually confusing, because I actually didn't think I had very much written for this, but I do. Okay, so I guess let's look at this. So our documentation string is click on an element with class I. We'll change that. Get all attributes starting with data I key. Assemble these into an object. Find the closest element with class I store. Get source element by calling get source element on I store element. Attach assembled object data to source element using set data. Okay, so Yeah, I was right. I don't have much written because this was the original version and this is not what we're doing anymore. So you can see here, for example, with set data, I'm getting the element, I'm getting the data, and I'm getting a key name. I think it's an optional key name. Yeah. So it's not optional if it's an object. So anyways, um, oh no, it is optional because yeah, we if key name. Oh, okay. We overwrite that. We overwrite this key name variable here. Um, let's call this like data key name. Just to be clear, it's not like important that we're overwriting it here because we're not actually using the original key name in here, but it's nice to just be clear that, that's what's happening. Okay. Um, so, yeah, so I'm just setting the data on the top level element, and that's not actually what needs to happen. So in our new idea for this, inputjs library, what's going to happen is we're going to go to the source element, and we're going to ask that source element, hey, do you have any uh, do you have one of these um, pieces of data that I want to set, on you? And it's going to say, no, I don't have any of those. And then you're going to look at its children and its children's children and see if they have any that need to be set. So this is, it's a good start, but it's not exactly what we want. Um, and if, maybe that's not a reason to throw it all out, but I find sometimes that that when you have code like this that kind of does what you want, but it's not really doing what you want, um, and it differs in a significant amount of a significant enough of a way, it makes sense to just rewrite it because this isn't hard code to write, right? This isn't super hard code to write. So let's actually rewrite it. We can refer back to it, if there's something that's confusing us. And let's just see, I guess we could have a new module for this code. Um, yeah, I think that would make the most sense. So let's start up a new folder and call it inputjs. And I'm going to copy some old code into there. Okay. So now we have our input.js, we have our package JSON, we have query.js, we have parse data attributes. We might need that, so we'll leave it in. And we have DOM utils. And let's call this input.js. And in here, let's get rid of this for now. And let's get rid of that for now. And we'll just have query.js. And we'll delete all this. And we're going to go into our terminal, and we're going to go into this folder. And we're going to do, I don't know if we have to do npm init, because I think all npm init is going to do is add this. Oh yeah, so we want to change this. So this is complicated. I think I'm just going to say like handle reactively. It's not even reactively doing anything, but I guess it kind of is. Reactively updating the DOM. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say for now. It's not the best description. So let's just do an npm install. And then I think there's, no, I guess that's all I need to do, right? So I have these 3 local packages. Okay, cool. So, and then I have this inputjs, index.js file. So let's start building what this should do. So one thing that this library is doing is watching for when a switch is turned on, and one thing that it's doing is watching for when a save button is clicked, and the other thing it's doing is watching for click events on elements with an attribute of data I key. And I just want to say and data I value. Okay, so it depends on the switch library, so I think that's something we'll probably want to install here. And I think Webpack, like once we kind of publish all of these libraries publicly, I think it's gonna, you know, yeah, I mean, it absolutely should take out the duplicate, Switch.js libraries and, just have them in one module. So this shouldn't be a problem in the long run to install the Switch.js library here, even though we're also including it in our, main Artisfy package. So, what did I call it? It's just Switch.js? Yeah, it's just Switch.js. So let's go here and we'll say npm install, and it's just a regular dependency. So we'll go up and we'll go Switch.js. Awesome. Okay, so now we want to import so what am I think I do a default export here, right? Yeah, okay, so I got all this stuff. So let's import switches, because I can't call it, well, I guess I could call it switch with a capital S, because that's probably not reserved, but I'm going to call it switches, or maybe like switch, yeah, no, I'll call it switches. Okay, so then we do, because I don't want it to seem like the standard JavaScript. It's a terrible name. Okay, so I shouldn't have used a reserved word for a library name, but I actually do kind of like it too, and it's very unlikely that someone else is going to take it because it's a reserved word. So there's that. Okay, so now we have switches. So before I write any of this code, I just want to kind of specify what this is doing. So I guess we could just copy this. Yeah, I like that idea. Just copying this into here. And then we'll also copy this. And I think we'll just kind of improve and simplify this documentation and use that as, how the code is set up. Wait, why? Oh, that's weird. Oh no. Okay. This is one line. Sorry, I thought this was like another like A dot. Okay, my bad. Okay, so then we got this. Okay. Okay. So I think it's likely that we want these to be in separate files. So it's actually likely we're not going to need this in this file. So let's see. Watch for when a switch is turned on. So okay, first of all, I want to have an export here, and I just want it to say, I think like init. And that's because I'm thinking that at the end of the day, I just want to call, input output dot init and have that do all of this stuff at once. So that's going to watch for when a switch is turned on and get all that stuff. It's going to watch for when a special save button is clicked and do all that stuff. And it's going to watch for click events on elements that are choices. And I think that's not ideal to like couple all of those things together, but I'm going to do it for now. So we have that. And init is going to be a function, right? So we're just going to have like a function called init here, and we know that that's going to be there. So let's say like import the first library, import, I mean, we don't really have to spell that out either, because we know it's going to be something like, like switch turned on watcher, or yeah, from something like this, right? And that's a terrible name. I'll rename it. Save button clicked the watcher. And the last one is choice. So let's do this, and we'll do like choice clicked watcher. And before each of these, we'll just say init. And then inside of here, we'll have this. Yeah, okay. So this is pretty self-explanatory as far as like what this is doing. It's something that we only want to call when the DOM has been loaded. Although actually, now that I think about it, that's not something I necessarily want to rely on. If ideally, I want to use event delegation so that I'm not relying on the DOM to be loaded, because if a new element gets added, that element's going to have to work too. So I guess the question is, do I really want to have to call init here, or do I just want to import the library? So instead of having this, what if I just say like import inputjs, right? And that has side effects that set up all of these, watchers. And then if I want to like customize how those, work, I can do that by like saying, import inputjs, from this, and then I can like pass in some options here, right? I don't know. I'm not sure which one I prefer. I like the simplicity of just being able to import it, but I don't like it in that like there's probably going to be some options I want to pass in, and I'm more comfortable doing it here, on the initial, like when we're initializing everything, than doing it, after everything's been automatically initialized and then kind of like patching the options in later. So, not that both aren't possible. I just prefer this. So I think I'm going to leave it like this. Okay, so this makes sense to me. I think we just need better names, right? So they're not terrible. But let's init what is this really watching for? Okay, so like how about initialize the input component watcher? Okay, so we have that instead of that. And then initialize the input save button watcher. And then like input choice watcher. And I just like that a little bit better because it kind of unifies all of them as having to do with the inputjs library. Okay, so that all looks good. I'm going to pause for 1 second and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Let's move quickly here. I only have 15 minutes. So this all makes sense to me. I think it works. So let's start building out these individual components. So the first thing we want to do is have this input component watcher, and that's where we're gonna have this code, and that's where we're gonna have this code live too. Okay, and then let's also just quickly create these other files. And copy, their documentation too. And we can put the libraries we'll need at the top of the page too. And the last one, okay, so now everything's going to be split up and hopefully easier to understand. It's not just going to be in one, giant file. So let's start, I think, with this one. Okay. So we're going to watch for when a switch is turned on. We're going to check its data attributes to see if the turned on element, and let's call it switched on element is a data store. Transfer the data from the trigger element and all of its children to this newly activated switches children. Get the data, and then we explain kind of how that happens. We get the data from the trigger element by looking up all data O key values and getting the data in the way it wants to be gotten. Search for data I text elements and add the data to their value. Search for data I choice elements and add the data to their data O key value. Okay, so I guess this this is pretty self-explanatory, this step right here. Get the data from the trigger elements from the trigger element by looking up all the data OK. So we've already written this. This is literally what the output.js library does. So I'm very excited about that. So this is going to be something like, like output dot, I don't know what we're going to call it yet. It could be like parse DOM or something. Let's just see what we call it here. We say get data from DOM. That's a pretty good, or no, sorry, we call it get data from root node. That's a pretty good name. Get data from root node. Yeah, let's call it that for now. So it's going to be like output / get data from root node, and then we're going to pass in the element, and it's going to give us back either an array or an object, and so we'll just like have this as an example where we have like an array with a group of objects, because that's going to be the most likely scenario. Yeah, okay, I can see how this might get complicated, because this isn't actually what we want. Yeah, so what I'm thinking at this point, like when you're doing an inline edit, the data is going to be relatively flat. So what I want most like what I really want is just an object, possibly with other objects in it, right? So like it could have, but mostly I just want an object where like it's just like key value, key 2 value 2, I just want it to be flat so that I can just kind of search through this object really quickly and see if it matches, with these input elements, right? So I can add the data there. So there's a couple ways I can do that. One, I can just assume that the data is going to be relatively flat, and I can just use this function anyways. Or I can have like a function on top of this that flattens this data. And again, I'm assuming that there's not going to be any overlapping things. But basically, I would loop through all the arrays, get all the objects, and add them to one kind of master object. And so yeah, so that would assume that the keys aren't overlapping. And I think that's a pretty safe bet. If I'm inline editing something, but I mean, it's not robust, right? If I'm relying on the data being flat, it's not a robust solution. And if someone else uses this library in the future, they're going to have to look out for that caveat in the README, and they might be really upset that this library doesn't support that. It doesn't support like nested. But I guess the other option, right? So if I do get back something that looks more like an array with objects, and and each of these, can have like the same key with different values. What do I do with that, right? So I guess I have to look through all of the input attributes, and I have to see what is their approximate position, right? So I think I think I am going to assume that the data is flat, because this is like if I'm triggering, yeah, I mean it's not the best for someone else using this library in the future, but I really have to just focus on the use case I'm building this for. And I'm not building this inline edit library to edit multiple components at the same time that all have similar data. You're only editing, like it's making it easier to edit multiple components, but you're only editing one component at a time, and that data is not going to overlap. The whole idea behind this library is that the data is not going to overlap. So it doesn't make sense to make something super robust and powerful when it's not really serving the use case. Okay, so let's say that this outputs this, and then we're gonna say like flatten, and we're just gonna say like data equals, and then we're going to say flatten data, and then we're going to say that outputs, and we can have this be like a more realistic example, where it has like, different keys, and then this last one has a different value. So that's going to end up being, A2 and then B1. Okay. And again, we're assuming, and we'll just write here, like assuming the data is already flat and keys won't be overwritten. Yeah, won't ever be overwritten. Okay. And we'll just say using flatten here, assuming the data is already flat, and keys won't ever be overwritten. Okay, so that handles that. So watch for when a switch is turned on, check its data attributes to see if the switch element is a data store. So here's something else I'm confused about. So let's go into our example. So if I click this timeline item and it activates this inline edit, do I just want to check this element for the data I store, or can this inline edit just be a parent element, and so this is the thing that gets switched on. And then it has a child element, one second, that has the store on it. Is that something I think is necessary? Is that something I think should be allowed? I don't see why it would be necessary. I think, it is tightly coupled to make it, only have to be on this element. But I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want it to be on that element, because first of all, that element is 99% of the time going to be the parent element of all the input elements. So you're set there, right? And then it's also the only real point of the store, other than that, is to point back, is to hold a reference, right, to the source element. So I don't think I'm gonna allow that. I think it is gonna just have to be on the actual one that was triggered. Okay, so that's good. Then we transfer the data from the trigger element and all of its children to the newly activated switches children. Okay, so we get this data, right? And then we search for data I text elements and add the data to their value. And we search for data I choice elements and add the data to their value. So I think what I would really like for this case, for these cases, is to so I guess there's a question, right? Do I loop through all of these keys in this object, in this output object, and search for these keys in this attribute or this attribute? And it's not going to be exactly this attribute, so that's a little bit of a problem, but it's not a huge problem, right? So yeah, so do I search for them in this attribute and then fill them in? Or do I assemble some kind of separate list using this, and then use that to kind of fill in the data somehow, right? So like maybe these input elements return, you know, an object, and this object, geez. Okay, I'm going to just do it down here. So maybe it returns this object, right? And this object has like a, and it's equal to a function. And maybe this function is like, you know, set data, right? So yeah, for this element. So this data matches this data, right? So we're going to loop through these keys, and then this is the, you know, the input data, right? And so this has a key here too. And so it's going to see, oh, okay, it matches. I have the value that needs to go in there. Where do I put it? And it's like, oh, I have a function. Just put this value in there. So we're going to just put that in there. And then this function is going to have a reference to the element that this key was pulled from, and it's going to know how to set it. Now, the only reason to really do that is if there is a reason to like reuse that kind of code. So let's look at this one. Is there a case in here where we're going to want an array of, an object representing all of the input elements data that has, you know, values, one of which is a function that allows you to set the data on that element. Okay, so we watch for when the special save button is clicked. We find the nearest data store ancestor element. We transfer all the data from this data store element and all of its children to the original trigger element and its children. And we do that by searching for data I text elements and adding their value to the data, and we search for all data I choice elements and adding their value to the data. Yeah, okay, so so the answer is no. I mean, unless this object is returning multiple things, right? So it could return like a set data function, and this is pseudocode, you know, this isn't actual code, but it could say like this, right? And we could say, just to be clear, we could say like this is a current value, right? And then you know, we're doing both things at once. So this object would be returned from something like get input elements data from root node. And this, is a terrible name, but, we would pass in an element, and we would get back, something like this. And so we would get all the keys, and then we would be able to get the value from it. So that would be useful for this, right? Because, but I think doing it separately might make more sense. So instead of doing this, we're just looping through these keys, and then looping through all of the input elements that are the children. I guess it is a little bit easier if we have this object. Set the data. On the trigger element. So I have to go actually in a minute by looking up all data O key values. Yeah, I think this is actually all a lot easier if I have this kind of thing. But what I would really like is for it to have two outputs. So I would like to have one output be like this, set data for this element, and then the same for B, the same for C, and then for the other one, I would want the values, the current values. So we would say 1, 2, 3, and this one is get input elements current data. And then, yeah, we have X, Y, Z, and C, P, B, B. Okay, I think that makes more sense. And then we can use these for different cases, right? So this we're going to use here, and then this we're going to use here. So that's going to be the thing that does A and B here. And then and I think we could also use something. So yeah, so this is going to get input elements set data functions. It's a terrible name. We'll rename it. So, and then I think we could also have get output elements set data functions. And then I think we can combine these. And the reason why we would want the output one is we're also going to need to set the output data here, right? And then I think what we could do is we could have a parent one. So let's just say output helper functions. And this one says get set data functions, and you pass in a root node. And you also pass in which kind it is. Is it input or is it output, right? So then based on that, it's going to know which one to call, which function to call. And these functions are probably going to work pretty differently in the way they get their data, just because the API I've set up for myself is a little bit more complicated for the input scenario than the output scenario. Set data functions. Yeah, so I think that could work. I don't think it's that bad. We'll come back to it next time and think through it. You know, I keep apologizing, saying that, you know, I'm sorry that we didn't get to the code. But honestly, this is the code. Like, thinking through this at a high level, making sure that everything makes sense, this is the code. If you just rush into designing a program before you fully thought it out, you're going to end up with a lot of edge cases that you didn't consider. And so thinking through it as much as you can and thinking through, you know, because you're really doing yourself a favor in the long run. You can get something working today, sure, but like, what is it that code going to be like to work with in the future? And you're really doing a favor to your mind, to your own mind, to have that code be easy to work with down the road and easy to understand, where you can just kind of read through it and it makes sense. And that's really what we're aiming for here. And that's, you know, 99% of the craftsmanship of coding is just being kind to your mind, honestly. So, yeah, because it's not just your mind, it's other people's minds too, you know, when they try to read your code or parse your code down the road. And that, you know, one of those other people is you, because, you know, I guarantee you 6 months from now, you're not going to understand what the heck you wrote. You know, and it's even like, you know, 4 weeks from now, right? If you don't touch it in that long, you're a different person by then as far as the understanding of your code goes. Okay, so we spec'd out this. We're not quite sure we're going to use this API yet, but we'll think through it some more next time and hopefully get a little bit further along. And maybe my ideal, I think, would be to unify this and this a little bit more. And in order to do that, I think we need to think about how the you know, the input.js code is set up and see if we can kind of simplify this API. I keep calling it an API. I know people aren't going to agree with that, but I think of it as an API. So simplify this API to the point where this data is as easy to parse as the output JS data. And if we can do that, then, you know, we can unify these functions more, right? And then, you know, this function isn't as much as of a wrapper as just kind of like a, you know, a little what do you call it? Like sprinkle of syntactic sugar, right? Or I don't know exactly what you would call it. Okay, so anyways, thank you for watching. Have a great day. Yeah, I will be back next time with hopefully a little bit more coding.